you got to learn to fail before you actually succeed.
Yeah, and I even failed some while I was succeeding too. Like there's been plenty of failure.
How did you end up on the journey that you are on right now, and how did you end up on being an entrepreneur and just creating inorganic?
Yeah, so I've been a serial entrepreneur for over 20 years. I have started some companies of my own. I've also been brought in as an executive to other companies to run them temporarily. And I've managed to find exits for several of those companies. And in doing this, I learned a few things. First of all of the exits were to strategic buyers. So big companies that were not looking to run the companies that I had as standalone units, but were trying to tuck them in as feature enhancements to bigger products. That was thing A. And then thing B was not all these companies were doing very well. So some of them were having financial difficulties. And I realized by sort of changing the value proposition from this is what the cash flow of the company is, this is how it's doing financially, and you should run it as a standalone business. But by changing the value proposition to this is the kind of value it creates as part of your product, I was able to create sort of compelling narratives around acquiring these companies. So with that, I started a company called Basis State with a co-founder, a friend of mine, which was finding VC-backed, mostly software companies that were struggling and finding them strategic acquirers. We did reasonably well with that company up until like late 2022. And then, the market for acquisitions became much tighter. So I took what we had developed and I created Inorganic, which is it's a self-service platform for startups to find strategic acquisitions.
You use the word serial entrepreneur. That's not something we hear very often. Uh,
Right.
what's the reason that you would qualify yourself as a serial entrepreneur, and what were your aspirations that you ended up being a serial entrepreneur?
Well, I always had, ever since I was a kid, I had an eye towards entrepreneurship, but I started somewhat late in life. So I very much had a traditional business background. My first job was actually with the State Department. So the government, I went and got my MBA. I started with a big company initially, and then I sort of moved over into startups
Hmm.
from there. But by the time that happened, I was almost 30 years old. So it was not this sort of young founder kind of scenario for me. I very much had a traditional business background prior to becoming a serial entrepreneur. And then the serial part of it, I mean, it's just the reality of I've had several over the course of my career. I never set out to be a serial entrepreneur. I think it's great to have a company that runs for 20, 30 years and have that be the only one. But it just so
Hmm.
happens that the companies that I was running, and the first one I ran, actually just kind of got tired of it. I had run it for 7 or 8 years. I didn't really see where I should take it next, and so I sold it and moved on to the next one. So I think the serial is just accidental more than anything, but the entrepreneur thing was very much by design.
Okay, that's great to know. So, what was your thought process behind the name? Why A Organics?
Oh yeah, so inorganic when it's funny because I get a lot of questions about this, which means it's probably not the best name because I thought I thought everybody would know the meaning of it. But when you talk about inorganic growth, that
Mhm.
means growth by act. But it's funny because if you ask ChatGPT what inorganic does, they say that we do inorganic chemistry, which couldn't be further from the truth. So not everybody knows, including ChatGPT, what we do.
No, I do think this is a very creative name, but it's honestly one of my favorite questions to ask entrepreneurs because it always ends up getting really, creative answers and really nice stories out of them. So I would like to know what is your philosophy when you're, planning an exit for a company? What's your thought process? Would you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so the companies that I specialize in, they are tend to be VC backed, which also means that they have some interesting tech. Because one of the first things that somebody does when they raise that first round of VC is build some tech. So most of them have some interesting IP that could be of use to an acquirer. And then what we try to do is ignore the financials to whatever extent we can. Because the reality is, if you take an interesting piece of tech and somebody buys that tech, a large company buys that tech, what they're doing is they're going to incorporate that tech into whatever product they have. So their business model is not particularly interesting to them. What they're more interested in is, what can this tech do for my business model? So we do something, we take that tech and we pare it down to use cases. So we say, all right, this tech has this capabilities,
Mm-hmm.
and where are these capabilities of use to an acquirer? And what we find is, by going through that process, we find different categories of companies that would be interested, and they may not be in that startup's core market. So we might find that there's this, category over here that could use the tech, even though it has nothing to do with the startup's core category. And just by finding those different segments, we're able to cast a wide net on prospective acquirers, which means, we have greater odds of actually finding them and acquire the more contacting. That was very much done manually by the services company that I mentioned. And then inorganic, the platform tries to sort of replicate that whole process of identifying these different use cases and acquirers.
Okay. So, that tends me to believe that you must come across very interesting businesses. And if I were to ask, what would be your, most hardest company that you had to find acquirers for, or what was your most interesting business that you came across and you had the opportunity of, converting?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest ones for us have always been data driven companies,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason why is those are really easy to incorporate into
Mm-hmm.
other companies. If you don't have to worry about UI and how we present this to the end user, if it's just data in the background, that's always very easy. Not to mention, it's a little more broadly useful
Mm-hmm.
than something that's got a very specific user interface to it. So, data companies are definitely our favorite. And then the ones that have been hardest have been consumer companies, and
Mm-hmm.
specifically anything that is trying to do something in social, for example, is
Mm-hmm.
really, really tricky because um, those companies they become useful with scale, right? And most of the companies
Mm-hmm.
that we're dealing with don't have the scale, and so they're only marginally useful to acquirers. So those have been the ones that have been failures, have tended to be in that category for sure. And then the data companies are the ones we feel the most comfortable with.
Okay. So, how do you think has AI impacted what you do, and what hasn't impacted the speed or just the effectiveness of what you're doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, it has. We have AI in our workflows, and so we're using it.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing is, had I developed inorganic 3 years ago, it would probably look so different than it does now, because it probably would be AI first.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the decisioning that we're doing, we've kind of pushed it onto the user. The user has to go into our interface. They have to configure some things. They have to make decisions in there. I feel like if I had started with, all I'm trying to do is get them all the way through this process and get interested acquirers contacting them, and AI were around, or at least generally available the way it is now, I would have designed it really differently. So it's somewhat impactful now. Would have been really impactful a few years ago. But we're using it to the extent possible. I think it's so new. The one shortcoming I'm seeing in the way we're using it is, we still have to check everything.
Mm-hmm.
So the generative AI will come up with if it doesn't have the answer, it'll come up with some sort of hallucination, and then we have to get that out before a user sees it. So I think when this gets better and more reliable, and it stops sort of filling in the blanks when it doesn't know,
Mm-hmm.
that's when it's going to be really, really useful to us.
What's the most common problem that you've seen faced by startups in today's climate specifically?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is that they were capitalized to be, breakout successes,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not there. It's less like these companies that we see, most of them are not total failures. They have some revenue, they have some happy users, they have a
Mm-hmm.
core base of users that could be actually profitable. But the problem is, they've tried to shoot for the moon, right? And they've probably taken on too much capital, and they're having trouble meeting those milestones that it takes to raise more capital. So I think the biggest problem I'm seeing is how these companies were capitalized, and had they
Mm-hmm.
been a little bit more conservative in the kind of money they were taking, as well as their ambitions to make the company big at the outset, I think they would be better off. There's nothing wrong with taking venture cap at all, but it's helpful if you have sort of a repeatable, scalable go to market before you actually take that money.
Okay. So, just moving on to a little bit of a personal side,
Yeah.
what are your aspirations for the next 5, 10 years, and where do you see yourself and in organic being in the next decade?
Decade. Wow. That would be my longest stint yet with any company. I really want to solve this problem of wind downs of valuable technology. It's crazy to
Mhm,
me that we're investing, billions and billions of dollars in building up this technology that companies could use, and then it just disappears overnight.
mhm,
And I'm really, I think inorganic and me personally are driven by solving that particular problem. Whether it takes 2 years to solve, whether it takes 5 years to solve or 10 years, I'm not sure.
mhm,
Whether it creates a huge company or just maybe a smaller company that's a data layer that, helps other companies accomplish this goal. I don't know that either. But that's really what's driving me. And that's sort of the vision I have is making a big dent in that particular problem.
I would, move on to asking that what are your predictions for the startup landscape for the coming year, especially with the changes that we're seeing right now in the market, and along with the financial issues that are going on. So, what would be your predictions for the startup market?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of fallout from kind of the loose financing that was happening in 2020,
Hmm.
2021. I think it's kind of inevitable. I don't think it's an entirely bad thing that goes away because it didn't, frankly, to me, it didn't make a lot of sense and it didn't feel sustainable. So I think we're going to continue to see companies failing, unfortunately. Um, and then I think we'll see something that sort of reverts back to normalcy,
Hmm.
which is to me, very much we're basing company value on its long-term potential for cash flow, and so we'll see more conservative financing. I think temporarily we're going to see a lot of fallout. I think temporarily we're going to see a lot of focus on short-term profitability, but I
Hmm.
think it's going to get back to where we're funding startups that have maybe are not short-term profitable, but are longer-term profitable or at least viable profitably, and that'll probably start to return to normalcy. I mean, I think it's more of a 2025 thing than a 2024 thing, but
Hmm.
I see it reverting back to maybe where it was in 2017, 2018, something like that.
Okay. So, as someone who has a bird's eye view of a lot of companies in the market, what are your opinions on outsourcing and how is the current trend shaping that landscape?
I mean, I've been outsourcing forever since I started 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I love it. It gives you a flexible construct to run your company. So if things start to dip, you're not in a position where you're laying people off or doing these other things that are extremely disruptive to a company. Not to mention there's a whole cost justification for doing it, for
Mm-hmm.
getting labor in different markets, things like that. So I don't see that. I think now we're really starting to see the benefit of it, given all the disruption that's happened in the past year or so with with layoffs and having to sort tighten up expenses and things like that. Uh, and then frankly, uh, sort of globalization and these tools that allow us to collaborate over the internet have made it a lot easier as well. So I think there used to be these time zone differences that were really painful, but
Mm-hmm.
everybody seems to be adjusting to those.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the outsourcing thing, and particularly outsourcing from different locations, is going to continue to increase over time, without a doubt. But I think we'll see particular interest, the next couple of years as things really tighten up.
Do you have a message for upcoming people that aspire to be entrepreneurs that would like to choose this as part of their journey? What would be one most important thing that you have to say to them?
Yeah, I mean, what I tend to tell aspiring entrepreneurs is, start with the end in mind on any given venture. I think one thing I see that happens that's unfortunate is everybody gets on the same track, which is they come up with an idea, maybe they join an accelerator, they start with a pitch to investors, they take on investment, and they kind of go on this,
Hmm.
VC backed, go big or go home track when that's maybe not what they really, really want. I know my first venture, it was really conservative. It was buying e-commerce companies and getting them more efficient and harvesting the cash flow from that. But that's
Hmm.
because my objective was really so I could sustain myself, feed my family while I became an entrepreneur. So I needed
Hmm.
something safe that generated cash flow. That's a fine objective.
Hmm.
And I think if people really took a step back and thought, all right, what am I trying to achieve with this step?
Hmm.
They might build more sustainable businesses. And then, they can always do the go big thing later, maybe when they've, learned a bit more or whatever. But it doesn't have to be one track. And, what you're looking for as an objective should very much drive how you treat your business.
So, if you were to recall your journey, and what would be the one memory that pops out and, is just like the crux of all of the, is the summarization of your entire career, would you say? Or one of the most interesting things that you went through?
Yeah, I mean, I have a funny story. It doesn't summarize my career at all, but I think
Okay.
it does summarize one of the things that's really interesting about entrepreneurship, which is that
Hmm.
anything can happen. And I think that's what's exciting to me. It's like it's not predictable. Uh, every moment has its surprises.
Hmm.
Sometimes you think things are going terribly, and then all of a sudden they start going well. And I love that. I mean, that's what gets me awake every morning. So there is one story, and I started back when I was dabbling before I started that e-commerce company I mentioned. Um, I was testing out some different ideas, and I thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if there was basically an electronic newsletter that you could, like a central office could create the content for it, but then local offices could put their branding on top of it.
Hmm.
And so I really quickly did sort of an MVP of this. I put up a website. This is over the course of a few weeks. Like, it didn't take me a lot of work. And I'm sitting in my basement working on this thing, and it was like 9 p.m. East Coast time. Somebody from the West Coast calls me, and it's a huge, billion-dollar cosmetics company, and they were interested in buying this thing. Well, it really wasn't much of a thing at that point. So,
Wow.
here I am trying to figure out, like, how can I deliver something that's scalable? Uh, it, Needless to say, I completely dropped the ball. That went nowhere, but it
Okay.
was incredible to me that this thing that barely existed could get that much interest from such a big company.
I think it would be important to know that, you got to learn to fail before you actually succeed.
Yeah, and I even failed some while I was succeeding too. Like, there's been plenty of failure.
So, why don't we, dive into that? And if you could tell people, because honestly, we rarely hear about failures of people who are, the big entrepreneurs that are on camera at all times. There are rarely any stories of their failures, which makes the common people think that it's not part of the journey, or it could be really disheartening. So why don't we dive into some of the things that made you learn a lot?
Yeah, I mean, you can look through my background and see, like, anything that was investor backed
Hmm.
and had a small exit, that was not the point, right? So those were
Okay.
failures. And even though I was able to land those companies in an okay place, that was not the
Hmm.
original plan. So those were all failures. And I think when you see that, when you see an investor backed company that doesn't go big,
Hmm.
that is technically a failure, even though it probably could have been worse. Um, so, those are all failures. I think, failure is absolutely just part of the game. Anybody has been doing this a while has failed plenty of times.
Hmm.
I also like to say entrepreneurship, you're basically in a constant state of not knowing what you're doing because everything you're doing is new. If you're working in a new market, you don't necessarily know it for several years. So I think we just sort of get used to this constant feeling of imminent failure. And most people who have been doing this a while or are serial entrepreneurs, they're somewhat humble because they understand that there's so much that they don't know, and if they go through life just assuming that they know everything, they're gonna really fail bad. So
Hmm.
I think failure is uh, very much part of it. And I think if you asked entrepreneurs just like you did me, when and whether they've failed, they probably have to be honest with you and let you know.
What's your motivation once you have had a setback? What's your motivation that gets you back on track, uh, drives you to get up in the morning with the zeal and zest that is required?
Yeah, I mean, some of it kind of depends. Like
Mm-hmm.
if I'm employing people,
Mm-hmm.
there's very much motive to keep them employed. So that's a strong one for me. I don't like to rescind on an employment deal
Mm-hmm.
if I've made missteps or made miscalculations. So that's a big one for me. If I'm a solo operator, like oftentimes it's just I get fascinated by making something work.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I would say inorganic very much falls into that category. There's a problem that I really, really want to solve.
Mm-hmm.
And it's less about a type of business I want to build, and it's more about sort of this fascination with this problem. So um, sometimes the motive is other people, sometimes the motive is making money, and then
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the motive is just I have to solve this problem.
All right. Thank you so much. That was very insightful, and I had a great time talking to you. And
Uh-huh.
thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.
Appreciate it. Thank you for yours. Have a good day.
To the audience that are with us till now, thank you so much for watching and please subscribe so we can bring more interesting startup stories to your screens.